Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Landlord Live. This is episode number 71, and I am your host, Eric World, joined by my co-host. Left to right, we have Andrew Schultz of Realty Edge. How you doing today, Andrew?
Good. How are you this morning?
I am doing pretty well. For those of
Good.
you who do not know, Andrew is an associate broker, property manager here in the Western New York area of what, approximately 125 units
About
or?
100 and coming up on 130. Yeah.
Oh, nice. A little growth
Yeah.
with the new year. I like it.
Yep.
And then in the middle, we are joined by Jennifer Rulins of Fish Property Management. And how you doing today, Jen?
Awesome. Love it. Good morning.
Good morning. It's good to see you. So we've got a few topics to discuss here today. We got one question from the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group that I'm going to slide in, which I just realized I didn't tell you guys about, but it's a softball for you. You'll be fine.
Okay.
And we got a few comments coming in already. Andrea says hello. How you doing, Andrea? This is a good reminder for anybody watching. If you have any questions, comments throughout the course of the live broadcast, we can pull them up on the screen using this handy dandy little tool called BeLive.tv. And I think the first thing I'd like to do is actually, why don't I start with the question that came into the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. This came in from Renee. And sorry, I'm going to be cutting your face off there a little bit, Jen. But Renee asked if anybody knows why potential renters don't show up. If it wasn't for me contacting them 1 hour before the appointment to confirm, they would not have thought to communicate their change of plans. Now, I know this isn't really shocking news for anybody, but I put it here because I thought really quickly you guys could share with me what you guys do to combat this. Do you just contact them an hour before? Do you have a system in place? Pretty quick, we can go through this. But Andrew, what do you do to combat no-shows with tenants not or interested renters not showing for walkthroughs of apartments?
So we've been using a service called AppToto, AppToto, for probably about a year now. It integrates with our Google Calendar so that when we schedule a showing, it'll automatically send the prospect a text message, confirms the appointment, lets them know the time, the date, the location, gives them the rent, the basics of the apartment. And then the day before, so 24 hours in advance, it sends them a reminder. And then I believe it's set to 3 hours before it'll send a final message saying, hey, please confirm for your showing. If you don't confirm, we're not going. And that seems to work pretty well. I would say that it's cut down on the number of wasted showings, like running out. We're spread out over the course or over the Buffalo metro area. So it's, it might be a 20-minute ride from us to get to the office, to the showing and back and forth. And I would say it's cut down on the number of trips that we've made for no reason drastically, simply because people either say we're not interested, or if they don't respond to it at all, it just shows that they never responded to it. And we just assume that they're no longer interested. So now we're only going out for good confirmed appointments. We do still have some people that confirm and then never show up. They either can't find the place or whatever the reason is. You're never going to avoid it all, but I would say that's cut down on our no-shows drastically.
If you had to guess, before you're using that service, and I have it on the screen, AppToto, before you started using that, what would you say your no-shows were versus now? And I know that's probably just going to be a guesstimate, but if you had
honestly, it's kind of hard for me to put a number to that, because before we were using this service, we were manually calling everybody to confirm before showings. So if we weren't getting messages back, we were kind of doing the same thing. But you would get people who would say, oh yeah, I'm going to be there on the phone, that would then not show up. I think that when they pick up and they have that interaction, that voice-to-voice interaction, they're more likely to say, yes, I'm going to be there, even if they have no intention of actually being there. When it's a text message and they don't respond to it, I think it takes, I don't want to say it takes the pressure to lie off of them, but that's essentially what it does.
Yeah, it sounds like Andrea is using your system that you were using before, as far as just calling them and making sure. And you're probably right. You add a little bit more guilt to the equation if they don't show and they actually talk to a human.
Yeah, exactly.
Texting. Yeah. But my favorite part about your app Toto is that it rhymed. You said, if you don't, what do you say? Are you going or no? If you're not going, we're not showing or something. You said something
along those lines. Yeah.
Everything should be a rhyme,
right?
It's sticky for people. So Jen, what do you do in your system to help eliminate no-shows from people that said they were interested in doing a showing of a rental property?
Sure. I would say before we made the switch to what we're doing, which is similar to what Andrew's doing, we probably had about 30 to 35% were no-shows. And I'm going to take a crack at why. I think when I used to take the leasing calls, what would happen is somebody would call, inquire about the property, state the details and the qualifications, and they could self-identify that they weren't interested or wouldn't meet those, but they're not going to sit there and say, well, I have bad credit, so I'm not going to see this apartment. I would sell to the point of making the tour, and they would just go along with it, and they would just not even write it down or care. I think that's part of it. I don't think that's all of it. So we have used a service called rently.com. We currently use ShowMojo. There's another one called Tenant Turner. And those are optimal. I mean, I think some of them have programs and plans small enough for the single family homeowner. In fact, I know ShowMojo does. But we're with ShowMojo now. And this is perfect for us. We have a 3-person leasing team. So we have 3 different people making appointments. And basically, ours just takes it a step further from what Andrew does. But if you're on our website and you're looking at our properties, and it could be any time, day or night, right? 3 a.m, and you go, oh, 100 Main Street, that is for me. You can click, you can see the times available to show, you can set the appointment. And because the system is really, really smart, it knows where the leasing agents are going to be, what's optimal. It piggybacks tours, all based on settings we put in. And so the leasing agent sees it come up on their calendar, and then it's automatically confirming with them. It solicits their driver's license. We don't show without a driver's license on file, so we know who we're meeting with. And that's all held in the system. And so it solicits for that. It confirms with them and lets them know, of course, if they didn't confirm, the tour cancels, and that's all customizable for us, that we've set up.
Okay.
It's even so slick that if the tenant calls from the number they registered the appointment with, close to the appointment time, it knows that they're probably calling to say they're going to be late. And it prompts them, like it'll pick up and go, are you calling because you're going to be late to your 1 o'clock appointment? And they can click like, I'm going to be more than 15 minutes late or less than 15 minutes late. If it's more than 15, it prompts them to rebook. If it's less, it notifies the agent, and we've set up that they'll wait. That's what we've set up for our system. So yeah, no shows, huge waste of time, big issue in our industry. And there's great technology solutions for it.
Yeah. It's always interesting how every 6 months to a year, it seems like they add some little extra feature. And then now it's like, well, you're 15 minutes late, you can click this button. So that's the great thing, though, about being a landlord today versus being a landlord or property manager 20 years ago is the amount of automation and tools and resources available for you if you're willing to invest in them are there.
Yeah, the ability to leverage your time in this industry is basically critical to the success of being in property management. And I would say, I mean, even beyond leasing, some of the software programs that have been popping up in the last, I would say 2 to 3 years have been such game changers in this industry. So,
yeah. All right. We have some recent news stories that I'm going to pull up onto the screen here. I'm going to try and go solo on this PDF. So this right here, what we're looking at is this comes from CHCDF. That is the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding. And what we're looking at here, and the reason I have this particular article or this PDF that was shared on screen is we're talking about the government shutdown, which has been a huge topic of conversation in the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group for landlords, property managers everywhere. And I think one of the issues that we've been running into is a little bit of misinformation on some of this. So I was going to kind of read through a little bit of this and explain a little bit, and then maybe just get your guys' insights here. The main thing that I've learned from doing research on this, and we did a podcast that's going to be airing actually tomorrow on this, is there's 2 different sections of Section 8. And maybe that's the wrong word to use, but there's the Section 8 project-based assistance. And what this is a situation where the building itself is determined that is a Section 8 project building. So in Section 8 project based, the Section 8 voucher does not move. It stays with the building. So if you're a tenant that moves into that building, you might have the possibility, if you qualify, to get Section 8. And then there's also what people are more familiar with which is called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. That is where the actual tenant has the voucher. And if they leave one property, go to another property, that they still have that Section 8 assistance following them to the next property. So what I wanted to cover here was mainly just this paragraph. It's talking about that as of January 5th, HUD failed to renew 650 rental assistance contracts that had expired in December prior to the shutdown. So those 650 contracts that HUD didn't renew in December will affect roughly 21,500 low-income households. So in addition to those 650 contracts, what we're looking at is an additional 500 contracts that could be up in January and an additional 550 in February that will be up. The reason that I bring this up is that a lot of people are kind of getting confused as far as thinking like, oh my gosh, when they hear this, they're like, Section 8 is up right now. That is Section 8 project-based Section 8 that is up right now in some situations, and it's getting larger. But I did call a local PHA, which stands for Public Housing Authority here in the Buffalo, New York area. They're actually the largest one that is in Buffalo. And what they said is, as far as the voucher program, you're looking March 1st. And in some cases, they think funding may evaporate even before that. So maybe mid-February. So if you're a landlord with the voucher program, then you might be looking March 1st, where funding could potentially be running up. So Jen, I know I just put out a lot of information there. What are your thoughts with that when you hear that? And do you have any takeaways?
Well, my first question would be the housing authority you called. Were they clear that this mid-February to end of February was for their property based on their renewal date, or that they were
through the housing choice voucher program? And they were actually clear in the fact that they're not clear on anything. And I think part of the reason being is that if you're looking at HUD, I forget how many employees are in HUD. There's maybe like 600 employees or something like that. I think like 20 of them are actually working right now, which are considered like essential employees. So they're not furloughed, but like 90% of the employees are furloughed. So from the top bottom going down, you just don't have information out there because there's just not enough people to man it and, get this information out there. So,
well, I think the thing I'm going to need to do, because like Andrew, we've got about a handful of Section 8 tenants out of our huge portfolio. So it's a very small amount, but for those owners, it matters a lot. And for those tenants, it matters a lot. I kind of thought things might be cleaned up by about now, but they're not in terms of like this situation. So I think the advice I would give anybody, and the one I'm going to follow, is it's time to call our housing authority and where those checks come from. See, all of our checks have the name of the county on them. So they're coming from the county. As far as I know, it's county funds. Of course, those funds come from somewhere else. So I just want to maybe ask some questions and prep our owners. But that's the only thing I could say is if you're involved in tenants with this, call the housing authority and ask them, because I think some of this, like they keep saying, the January renewals weren't done. The February renewals might get done. Well, that is 1/12 or 2/12 of the total amount, right? It's kind of like if you're a month behind on your lease renewals.
Right.
Anyway, that's the way I think about it.
So I'm curious, Andrew, I know you have some Section 8 Section 8 tenants. When you get that voucher, you know exactly which public housing authority it's coming from, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So if somebody is familiar with this and they do have tenants, because I've never had a Section 8 tenant, they should already understand if they've received funds in the past, what public housing authority it's through. And I can't say for every PHA, but the one that I called, they were extremely receptive. I called Belmont. They were happy to talk. I mean, this impacts their business huge. And for them, it's a chance to educate and keep people informed on what's going on, because for them, I'm sure an educated landlord is much better than somebody who's just freaking out and calling them and getting upset. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, and the weird thing is, like, we have actually, I think most of the Section 8 tenants that we do have are run through Belmont. And they've been, as far as actually outwardly communicating to the landlords, there's been nothing. It's been like total radio silence from those guys.
Yeah.
I spent some time over the weekend. I pulled one of the housing choice voucher. What's the word I'm looking for, Jen? Not the RFTA, but the HAP contract, the housing contract. I went through and read the housing contract line by line. And if this is an extended period of time thing where we don't have access to this voucher money, and if it puts an owner in a spot where like they need this rental income to make their mortgage and things like that, number one, it's important to remember, if the voucher doesn't pay, the tenant is still responsible for that entire rent, not just their portion, but the entire rent. And if the rent does go unpaid, there's nothing stopping you from doing an eviction, at least based on what I read. And I'm not an attorney, so take that with a big grain of salt. But from what I read and what I understood, I don't see anything preventing you from moving a Section 8 tenant, moving forward with an eviction on a Section 8 tenant if you cannot get paid and if this shutdown goes for an extended period of time. That being said, I can't think of a single court that's going to throw out a Section 8 tenant while the government is shut down. So
not in months 1 or 2.
not in months. Yeah, certainly not.
I would guess if this went to 3 to 4 months, which I think if that's what happens, we've got bigger problems than
Oh, for sure.
our Section 8 rents. But
Mhm.
if it went on that long, but you're right. I was just sitting here thinking like the 5 or 6 judges we sit in front of going, which one of those is going to give me a judgment?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I can't think of, there's one housing court judge in Buffalo that hears all of the landlord tenant cases. And there's no way, like just knowing that judge, there's no way that he's going to sit there and say, all right, well, the Section 8 portion is unpaid. He's not in month 1 or 2 at least. When you get to months 3 or 4, like you were saying, that's if this is a property owner that's needs this rent money in order to make their bills and things like that. Now you're looking at a situation where they might be a couple months behind on a mortgage payment or something like that if they don't have a good emergency fund backing them up, which hopefully they do.
Yeah.
But if they don't have that.
This is a good reminder about emergency funds and making sure that you do have funds available. Because I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Who would have thought that there'd be a shutdown that would be going this long, where you'd be worried about months and months of potential rent being lost? So
yeah. I mean, and if you get into the months 3 and 4, my final point there was basically once you start getting to that point, you're looking at a couple missed payments on a mortgage. You're talking about pre-foreclosure action and everything else at that point. So it could get very, very sticky unless something gets resolved and some funding gets pushed through.
Okay. We got a recent article that came up here. This is from, I hope I'm saying this right, Epic Times. And this was written by Miguel Moreno. And this was on January 10th. And he was talking about the New York City's new mayor is talking about seizing buildings from landlords in their State of City speech. So I'll read a little bit here. It says Mayor Bill de Blasio used his State of the City speech at the Symphony Space Theater on January 10th to sign an executive order on stage to seize property from landlords. He promised the measure would root out the worst landlord abuse. So it's scrolling down a little bit further on this towards the bottom here. I think we got a little bit more information. Let me just get it right here. The mayor plans to seize 40 buildings from the most distressed multiple dwelling buildings annually and give them to responsible owners, according to a press release. Neither a detailed explanation of the new office was provided, nor an explanation of how cases between the landlord and tenant will be investigated. He described the unlawful landlords as someone who makes the tenants' homes unlivable. What exactly qualifies as a property as unlivable is not specified. All right. So I think Andrew went first last time. Jen, what are your thoughts when you're reading over this article from Epic Times about the New York City mayor's proclamation?
I see it from both sides, right? I absolutely, I'm American. Private property is private property. You should get to do what you want with it. But there are certainly habitability standards. And if you're going to have the general public renting from you, almost all municipalities have enacted some sort of minimum requirements for habitability. When I read it, it seemed like they said that there was absolutely going to be an opportunity. There was going to be a series of warnings, fines, penalties. I gotta say, the one thing they do here in our municipalities, their leverage against these habitability standards and the rental ordinances is through condemnation. So they essentially take their rights through condemnation. And I would prefer to see.
What do you mean by that?
Well, condemnation would mean that they would condemn the property. So if in one of our municipalities, you have to have a rental inspection done every 4 years, comply with the rules, and you get a rental license, good for 4 years. If you are renting the property without a rental license and you're in violation of the ordinance, the city, by way of their codes department, will condemn the property. And so when you condemn it, nobody can live in it. Okay. And so it's a way of enforcing this sort of thing. And so, I don't know, condemnation is one way. Seizing a property and giving it to someone else. I've heard of this through these, what do they call them? Like revitalization programs. There's another word for it. I'm not coming up with. You would recognize it. And I get in a place like New York City, I'm sitting here in North Central Pennsylvania, and where I've come from, there's that one building in town, right? But it's usually empty. It's a hot mess. But in New York City, you have in big metros like that, there's landlords and people who own property that are renting them out to people who are not able to use the system. They're intellectually deficient or economically deficient, or even their immigrant status isn't okay. And you just got people living in terrible conditions. So I don't know what a city does when fines and warnings don't do it. I see that their hands are tied. So I see it from both ways.
Yeah. Andrew, what do you think when you hear an article like this or a news story like this?
It's pretty much right along the same lines as what Jen said. With the way it works here in most municipalities in Western New York is it starts with an inspection followed by a violation letter, and then if you don't clear up the violation, they usually give you a couple shots. And honestly, as long as you're working towards resolving the violation, they'll continue to work with you. But it's when you stop working the violation or just ignore it altogether, then it starts turning into fines, which turns into housing court, which eventually, at least in the city of Buffalo, can turn into a warrant. They can issue a bench warrant out of the housing court for a landlord that's not taking care of the property and things like that. And I think eventually they'll wind up trying to seize the property to drop it into receivership, but I don't know exactly how that entire process works, or how they go about doing it, or what the steps are before it gets to that process. But I have seen buildings in Buffalo that have gone into receivership before, simply because the landlord's not taking care of what the building needs and not making sure the tenants have a habitable living situation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think one of the things that I can kind of take away from that article too is how much of it's not really in writing really yet. It's just more like a proclamation, but they said there is no details. They did say there's going to be 40 properties, but what determines if a property is going to end up on that list? The other thing I thought was interesting is this going to be annually 40 properties every year? Kind of like in like some sales environment, it's like, the bottom 10% always get cut at the end of the year. Like, is this like, because that could get kind of dicey too if you're looking years down the line. Because year one, you could say, wow, yeah, there's some terrible properties out there. But 5 years from now, you might be kind of, pinching some properties that aren't as bad as you would think. So I don't know. Like a lot of things, though, there's proclamations and then there's actually what gets, shakes out at the end and what it ends up being a year from now. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Last article we have here that I'm going to share, pull us up on screen now. This one comes from Yahoo Finance, and it was written by Crystal Hu, and this was on January 10th, 2019. What she's talking about is the fact that Amazon eyes closed Sears stores for Whole Foods expansion. So I think most people, unless you've been living under a rock, are pretty familiar with the fact that Sears, Macy's, and a lot of other retailers are bellying up. And this image here on the screen is pretty interesting. What it's doing is it's showing where Whole Foods currently exist. And you can kind of see the green dots a little bit on the screen. It's usually coastal or bigger cities, but where there are Sears and Kmart stores have closed in the last 2 years as well. I thought that this was an interesting story to share because it does impact landlords as far as from, communities being able to be shifted from a dilapidated building turning into a Whole Foods. Andrew, when you're thinking about it in terms of that, what do you think of with Whole Foods potentially occupying more and more closed Sears stores and Kmart's?
I think it's a tremendous opportunity for Whole Foods, to be honest with you. I think that speaking about the Buffalo landscape, our current, vacancy rate on large retail, we've had Sears, we've had Kmart, we've had Macy's, we've had Toys R Us, Babies R Us, all take large swaths of space, like big chunks. As a matter of fact, like we were talking a little while ago before we started, McKinley Mall, which is in Hamburg, just south of Buffalo, was just foreclosed on. And one of the main reasons for that, what's that?
I said that was my mall growing up. It's like my childhood.
Summit Park was mine, so don't feel bad. That one's gone too.
Court, that's where my initial memories were forged.
Right.
Paid.
So,
sorry.
So the one article I was reading talked about how because of these large retailers, they account for, I think they said that the Sears store was like 25% of all of the usable space for the entire mall. I mean, it's a large store. When you leave something like that vacant, obviously it decreases traffic, and now you're losing your little retailers that are on the inner, in the inner stores and stuff like that, and it just spells bad news. So I think if Whole Foods can come in and pick up this, this real estate for much lower than what a normal rate would be, I think it's going to give them the ability to expand very, very rapidly and in a very real way across the entire country.
Yeah. Jen, what are your thoughts when you're reading through this article?
It's an interesting opportunity, and I think it would change the dynamics of a lot of communities with this planting of these Whole Foods and that show of optimism from a giant like Amazon. And so, I mean, I'm always curious to see what happens to these I say hospitals, I meant malls, these strip malls or like outlet centers and the indoor malls. I know I see them changing into colleges. We've seen some healthcare take over some. You see education possibly wanting to take those over, people who need a lot of real estate and things like that. So if I'm near a mall and there's a possibility of this happening, and I was thinking, oh, I got to get out of this property, maybe it changes my mind until I see how this goes, for sure. And I'm personally hoping that a Whole Foods comes near me.
Yeah.
That would be great. I would love that sort of access, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you kind of see these things happen over time. I know in Buffalo, like our market, like years ago, got transformed with Bethlehem Steel closing down, because that's where a huge source of jobs, and that community was a certain way, and then that closed, and then all of a sudden that property is not worth as much because you're not going to work a mile down the street or a half mile down the street. So it'll be interesting to see. Obviously Amazon, they probably have more resources than any company at this point, and it'll be interesting to see if they really put a lot of resources into these Whole Foods. I don't think they're going to jump in on these just to put a Whole Foods up and then have it attached to a bunch of empty space and a dilapidated space. I would think they'd have some sort of game plan of why they'd want to do this. So if they revitalize that mall, like you were saying, Jen, and some other uses, it could end up becoming this really cool hub for people to visit. And then all that surrounding property around it all of a sudden becomes more valuable, just like, around colleges or other areas where you have one thing that kind of impacts the value of the property. So
yeah, there was out in Rochester, it's basically like I would call it student living with like a first floor mixed use commercial. And the anchor tenant is a great big Barnes and Noble store. So it was kind of set up in a horseshoe with multiple levels. And obviously everything on the upper floors is residential, but the first couple floors is mixed use commercial. And then if it was shaped like a horseshoe, the Barnes and Noble would have been kind of right in the center of the horseshoe with commercial expanding around either side of it. You do something like that with a Whole Foods where you have, residential above with commercial scattered around it. Like that's a real game changer. That's a community in and of itself. So it's very interesting.
I mean, when we were looking at a place to live, when we moved from the rental property we were living in, like that was something my wife looked at. She said, how close are we to Wegmans or Tops or the grocery stores? Because that's a trip once, twice a week usually. So, those are things that people think about when they're looking for a living situation. So it's going to impact rents and landlords, certainly.
Well, and access to that network. So Amazon bought Whole Foods to increase their distribution networks. They want to be within 1 hour delivery of everybody in the country. That's part of the goal, right? So I don't know, I'm super dependent on Amazon. Like I don't know. I just am like, if I need toothpaste, I like order it from my phone.
Do you actually have the buttons?
I don't have the dash buttons.
I don't know anybody that has those buttons.
No, I haven't seen them, but like I'll order the toothpaste while I'm brushing my teeth. Like it's that easy. And I can imagine, like, and I've seen the drones and the delivery of that. And I can imagine if there starts to be hot spots around the country where you get access to that sort of distribution network. Now, if you're within that, your rental property, that's worth a whole lot more. All of a sudden, we're going to start probably putting on our listings like inside Amazon 1 hour network or something. As it develops, we're going to keep eyes on it, and of course, know how that's changing our communities and what changes what's desirable and what's not.
I think the sad part of what you're talking about is the fact that when Prime came out, it was such a revolutionary service of like, oh my gosh, 2-day shipping, and now it's going to be like, I can't wait a day.
I don't have time for this.
Yeah. Just,
and how you get the thing right now? Just get in your car and go to the store. I mean, that's really, I mean,
I can't be bothered to do that.
This is the markets, right? The markets are that Amazon heavily assisted in the euthanizing of these big box stores. And now they're going to eat up the remains. And I mean, but that's how capitalism works,
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Well, that concludes episode 71 of Landlord Live. Thank you guys for your insights. Enjoyed talking about these various topics. I feel like we were kind of all over the board today, which I liked. But yeah, until next week, have a great week, guys.
You as well.